pleasure to see you again. We've caught up a bit over the last couple of years, and I think the last outside of Australia was actually the Art kind of Science Museum for a meeting in February 2020.
January 2020.
Different world now.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh.
Yeah, we couldn't have imagined that so much would have changed.
So fast too. It's been a crazy time, and I guess you've just launched this Future of Arts and the Culture report, which I think is probably a great place to start for this, what I hope is an interesting chat. So tell us a little bit about about this report. What is it, and how did it come about?
Thanks, Seb. Yeah, the Future of Arts and Culture report was an independent effort, actually, from a group of arts and cultural professionals, including kind of myself, Annette Nees from the UK, who at the time was at the Royal Opera House, and a couple of other people, including kind of Tatio from ARIP, from kind of the ARIP team, working hand in hand with the foresight professional Scott Smith. And it was a group of individuals who really wanted to try and figure out if there were some drivers, some trends, some concerns that kind of were shared across the arts and cultural sector around the world. So it was a quite ambitious kind of little assignment that we set ourselves. And what we noted is that what COVID was leading to is lots of reflection about the future of the arts, the future of museums, the future of the cultural sector within specific countries. And those reflections were often driven kind of quite rightly by governments or funding agencies, but they led to a quite kind of country-specific and often art form specific kind of set of ideas about what the kind of primary, I suppose, trends kind of were. And we wanted to take a bit of a broader view. So what we did is we got together a kind of a list, almost like a kind of a Rolodex list of arts leaders kind of from right around the world, kind of from the Middle East to Asia, from New Zealand and Australia to Israel to, from India, right the way through Africa, all the way through Europe, North America, South America. And there were people that we knew, so there wasn't a huge amount of science behind the selection process, which I should, be upfront about. Yep. But people who we knew that were in, leadership positions, either in the museum sector, theatre, kind of dance, performing arts, music, all were in policy-making decisions as funders, ministers, or kind of other folks who were shaping kind of arts policy. And we asked them to engage in a kind of a foresight exercise, actually, to tell us what they thought the major concerns and trends were from their perspective about, kind of their patch of the arts. And to guide them through this process, we used a tool called Futurescaper, which is a kind of foresight platform developed by Noah Rafford and some collaborators. And it's almost like a very, very fancy kind of survey kind of tool that takes you through a scenario building exercise. So we took about 250 arts professionals from around the world through this scenario building exercise. And then we spent about a year analysing the stories kind of that we were told by these arts professionals. And late last year and at the beginning of this year, we launched the results of that at the Future of Arts and Culture.org. And that basically kind of unfolds kind of some of the scenarios that we felt were kind of common amongst kind of some of the professionals that we engaged.
Yeah, I really thought that was a really interesting report, because it really did highlight the commonalities across the globe, and I found it really interesting that climate was so prominent. It was really pleasing, really, that it was. Although the challenges that brings feel like the pandemic has almost been a rehearsal for that, a rehearsal that we've terribly failed as a global action. But do you want to talk a little bit about some of the other things? I think the big business models piece, and also that piece I think about the networks, I thought was really interesting.
Absolutely. So what the report kind of distilled was 3 scenarios of 3 kind of speculative futures kind of that might unfold over the next 10 years. And these are scenarios that could happen concurrently. Scenario 1 might happen to me, and scenario 2 might happen to you. Kind of a scenario 3 might happen to, kind of a colleague working in London or Tel Aviv. So the first scenario really kind of touched on that point that you mentioned. It was called Spectaculars and Small Stages. And it talked about the tension between the desire to create kind of for us in the museum sector kind of blockbuster exhibitions, kind of immersive spectacles, kind of which have in the past tended to be, kind of lucrative and important, from a business model perspective. Plus the desire for many of us in organisations to perhaps nurture more grassroots forms of artistic practice. And again, this could be in theatre, in dance, or in the museum sector. So this tension, kind of between the spectacular and the small stage. And, we've already started seeing that kind of playing out in kind of many kind of forums. This sort of trend towards, kind of the Van Gogh Live, kind of very, very immersive projection-led kind of experiences has been with us for some time. And what this scenario, kind of sort of digs into a little bit is in an age where COVID, climate change, kind of and many other issues might make object-led exhibitions or performer-led kind of stage productions logistically much more challenging, will we see a pivot more in that kind of sort of spectacular direction, technology-led kind of, or not? And the scenario really, kind of digs into, I suppose, what the kind of the financial kind of drivers kind of this, kind of type of production might look like. So that's our first scenario, and this came up, kind of, I guess, as a response to a huge amount of anxiety that we felt from kind of arts organisations, and this is. Not necessarily good anxiety, it's sort of genuine, almost existential anxiety about where the funding is going to come from, kind of for arts institutions of all colours, shapes and sizes in the future, and the necessity to really start thinking about kind of more commercial kind of business models. And one may look at that as a positive outcome of that scenario, or one may look at that as a worst case scenario. And these scenarios, I think, are deliberately ambiguous, deliberately meant to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, as well as kind of idea generators. So the second scenario, sorry.
I mean, there's certainly. I think just on that first one, I think the spectacular small stages piece really also, I think, for lots of institutions creates that challenge of what is the role of publicly supported institutions and what is left to the market. And I've been listening to a lot of reading and listening to a lot of people talking about the collapse of trust in the institution generally across our societies, and that institutions themselves have not been able to move at the pace that their communities have needed, and this has created a trust gap, and it's almost a trust gap now with not only with the things we put on, but also, and I think we might get to this later, the things we might be collecting and preserving for the future too. But it's interesting that in the spectacular world, I wonder whether there is this thing where we've started to see those as oppositional from within our fields. Yeah. And you and I have both put on these spectaculars ourselves and been involved in the development of some of them. But the sort of sense that the commercial market for them, which has really taken a lot of those those ideas and taken them to a much broader audience. Perhaps what the institutions that are established are failing to do is to pick up on that audience whose tastes have now been exposed to these new experiences and say, well, actually, if you like this, we've got these other ones that are now richer, deeper, more less based on just public domain arts works, but they're equally interesting and provocative.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. One of the most interesting kind of facets of working with a critical foresight agency like Scott Smith's Changes Group is that they really instill amongst kind of the group they're working with, in our case, this group of independent arts professionals, this notion of futuring and forecasting kind of being a sort of an overlapping, set of layers of possible futures. So the small stages and spectacular scenario that we looked at, both of those, facets, the small stages and the spectaculars, might be overlapping within the same institution. And you're a good example of that, where ACMI in the same exhibition might be doing a small stage and a spectacular. And that's certainly something that we attempt to do in the museum, in Art Science Museum as well, is try and bring the kind of intimacy and the rigor, of smaller, exhibitions or theatrical kind of experiences together with the epic scope of the spectacular, because it's that combination, I think, that can create some really interesting, behavioural change amongst visitors, and that's certainly, what we're really passionate about, I think, is exhibition makers and cultural producers here.
Do you think, that's interesting that you explicitly call out behaviour change, because I think that's something that institutions have not explicitly said very often. They've perhaps in many cases left that to artists and say, well, that's the artist's responsibility. We're not going to frame how people react to the artist. But of course, the curators select the artist, and the institution platforms the artist or the exhibition or whatever it is. It's been interesting. Looking at art kind of sciences programming over the last couple of years, and I need to say that I'm on the advisory board, so I'm not biased in any way in this. It's been super bold. It has been really bold, and I think it has been very clearly about introducing provocative ideas and actively, particularly around climate and environment, making some very particular choices to bring attention to things. But that's operating in also has operated in a very particular environment, and one that's been heavily reliant on cultural tourism.
Yes, correct. Yeah, so, you're right, I think the traditional, kind of icon notion of museums as neutral spaces, with no, privileged point of view, for instance. I think that idea has been comprehensively challenged over the last 20 years, particularly by, Indigenous groups and the decolonisation movement. It's frankly absurd to talk about a museum as a neutral platform. And our museum is not a public institution. Art Science Museum is a private museum. It's part of a larger entity, Marina Bay Sands. And it wouldn't be authentic, I think, for us to pretend that we don't have a curatorial view. We do, and when it comes to the social issues that we're very passionate about, particularly environmental issues, climate change, deforestation in Southeast Asia, conservation of endangered species, water, the ocean, these kinds of issues, we do take a very particular, almost campaigning stance, and we collaborate often with NGOs such as the World Wide Fund for Nature. And, you know, an exhibition which we did recently that you saw that does combine that small stage intimate storytelling with the large spectacular elements of immersive theatre, 2219 Futures Imagined, really did do that act of kind of placing people in a future 200 years from now where climate change had created really profound, almost unimaginable kind of impacts. And the purpose of that show, to loop back to what you were saying, Seb, was to create behavioural change. You know, we wanted people to come out of that exhibition and go, oh my goodness, if I don't want that future, you know, kind of what am I going to do today? You know, it wasn't just about education or, you know, kind of, or sharing artists' work. It had a really particular, almost activist-y kind of goal. And a lot of the projects that we've done that use immersive technology, whether it's AR, VR, you know, kind of, or simply theatrical staging, have had that goal. They're kind of almost trying to use the uniquely emotional media, you know, kind of immersive technology to get people into a state where they're perhaps a little bit more receptive, you know, kind of to making decisions in themselves about how they might want to, you know, kind of make the world a better place. This is super controversial, and I'm not recommending that, you know, kind of all museums or libraries or, you know, kind of galleries assume that position. It's absolutely a cultural institution's choice about how, you know, kind of, I suppose, how active, you know, kind of they want kind of their role to be. But that's our decision. That's been our platform, I guess, as a museum.
I mean, I think it's fascinating that an ostensibly private and at the end of the day for profit in the bigger entity institution in your case is perhaps better able to do that than the publicly funded, and I wonder whether that is something the public institutions need to take account of and ask themselves, well, why is it that this is obviously it's obviously a business decision as well as a curatorial and programmatic choice in your institution, and yet in publicly supported institutions, these same desires are being talked about purely in a social good way. I find it really interesting, and it really does point to the opportunities that perhaps the public institutions are not moving to seize for political reasons, but you know.
Possibly in our part of the world, but I think in Australasia you've got two really good examples of institutions that have found that balance. I mean, one of them is yours. You know, kind of ACMI does receive public funding, and you have been a pioneer, I think, in the creation of, you know, kind of immersive both collections, displays and temporary exhibitions that incorporate significant elements of, you know, kind of educational rigor and academic research, as well as being, you know, kind of having one foot in the immersive entertainment space, and that's, you know, genuinely laudable. Also, I think, you know, since we're speaking at, you know, the NDF, we have to do a shout out here to Te Papa. If anyone has figured out how to do, you know, kind of the large scale sort of spectacle kind of at, you know, at an almost epic scale, kind of with, you know, sort of curatorial rigor being at the fore, it's Te Papa. And, you know, they deserve a lot of global credit, I think, for the leadership that they've done in that area, the partnerships that they've forged with Weta, and just the sort of open-mindedness, I think, of their collections team, their exhibitions team, their interpretations curators to engaging audiences and in emotional as well as kind of intellectual ways. I think they've been there right from the start, and they've kind of laid those experiences through their history. But it's true that, you know, kind of our organisations are not common, you know, and there's still, you know, kind of quite understandably, I think, a reluctance from collections-based organisations to move away from object-based kind of curatorial work. And if we move, kind of over to the performance sphere, that's very, very difficult and kind of almost absurd, I think, for, kind of the performing arts to be considering, kind of non-physical forms of production. So, yeah, I could quite understand, kind of the difficulties, and I don't know if it's quite as clear cut as private versus public. I think that's a driver, but it's not the only one.
Yeah. So tell us about the second scenario.
The second scenario is my favourite one, actually, in the in the Future in the Arts and Culture report. It's talking about global networks of communities, and in this scenario, we've got three kind of headlines from the future, and I'm just going to mention a couple of them because I think they distill the opportunities and the tensions in this scenario really beautifully. So the first one, imagine you're reading this in your local arts kind of newspaper, and the headline says, "Network of local museums of Indigenous art stage a simultaneous global opening." And that's a very, kind of simple, sort of theoretical headline. But what it points to is something super interesting, which is the idea that kind of location and geography and locality may be less important kind of than sort of identity, whether that's cultural, racial or religious, and that kind of networks of communities kind of globally, kind of might kind of form almost kind of cultural institutions, or certainly very powerful cultural networks in and of themselves. And kind of again, this is not anything which is going to come across as a new idea to many of the people that are kind of listening in to us today. The notion of global networks of interest around, kind of specific communities has been around for a long time. But I think what's interesting here is this indication that as place becomes more difficult, as physical buildings like the ones that you and I occupy become more challenging, those kind of global agglomerations kind of might become even more important. And this I just feel has sort of tapped into something that feels really real. And it's also something, interestingly, that came up in our third scenario. Kind of which is about something very different, but it talks about kind of, for instance, a museum in India closes its physical operations to become an online museum for the global diaspora. Kind of like this is a headline from the future. That feels like it could happen tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? Like that feels like it's something that these notions feel like they're already here and they're kind of already bubbling under, and they're already starting to become kind of palpable kind of impacts of the sort of, kind of, I guess, that kind of post-COVID moment of us kind of living in, kind of networks kind of more and more. So I found this scenario really interesting because it drew upon kind of histories of network global communities that we've both been part of for longer than we would care to say.
Yes.
That also perhaps make us a little bit more hesitant, skeptical about, kind of hype around kind of network platforms that a lot of people are getting really excited about, like the metaverse. When you've been part of network global communities for as long as we have, and we've seen these spaces of collaboration kind of rise and fall many times kind of over 20 years, that it's not the platform that keeps people together, it's the people, kind of and shared interest. And I feel like that was a really interesting kind of point of identification kind of in that scenario.
Do you think, I mean, it's interesting that those platforms come and go, and there's always been this sort of opportunity for institutions in arts and culture to form wider networks, more diverse networks, but at the same time, this huge opportunity, which we're seeing right now, for communities to become impatient with the pace of institutional network forming and form their own. And that sort of the sort of the idea that institutions in the past have moved slowly into this space, while the communities that they used to represent have moved very quickly. In some cases, or their communities have changed, and so the sort of I guess I'm asking is what might be the role, particularly in the Asia Pacific, for this, because it feels like we are, at least in Australia and New Zealand, quite far from the global media networks that are still very dominated by the 20th century centres of media power, and those 21st century centres of media power, which may in 20, 30, 40 years' time be, Lagos and other places in what's now the global, what's perhaps called the global south. How are we aligning with that, and what might be the opportunities for different types of collaborations, networks and communities? How might we get ahead of, or what's the institutional role in this? I think there's a lot of...
Yeah. Well, actually, just taking a complete leaf out of the, kind of the report, and again, bearing in mind that this is very speculative, I think that one of the things that New Zealand and Australia specifically have as a huge and incredibly rich resources, their Indigenous communities, and the immense, wisdom, knowledge, and cultural, wealth in those communities. And perhaps one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic, which has been this, if you want, kind of return to the local, while the global has been challenging, at least from a physical travel perspective, is an opportunity to really, I think, sit with, those extraordinary communities in a more kind of meditative and reflective way. Of course, this process was well and truly underway, at different paces in both countries. We're well aware of that as Kiwis and as a Kiwi living in Australia. But I think, if we're looking for unique, sort of qualities that both countries have, this is something that sets them apart from anywhere else in the world. And what I've always found really fascinating is the Indigenous networks that already exist, kind of between kind of communities in Australia and New Zealand, the South Pacific, Canada, the US, kind of the Saami, kind of networks in the north. The power of being able to strengthen those networks and kind of think about, kind of what stories, kind of what knowledge can be networked and kind of shared at a time where physically being able to go places is frankly not practical, especially for our friends in New Zealand, but really for all of us. That feels like something kind of unique and special and necessary to kind of lean into.
Yeah, and that sort of points to the real opportunities of the institutional power being seeded and the platforms being both physical and digital that the institutions have that
Correct.
Can be seeded and then used.
Correct.
I still hear a lot of talk about people wanting to build new platforms within institutions, and it's perhaps the institution itself is a platform anyway. With its own power that can be passed.
Absolutely. I mean, this is sort of segueing quite nicely into our third scenario, which is looking at kind of platforms and what we call in the report that the multiverse, which is almost like in this specific context, a kind of a metaverse of platforms. And in this scenario, we're really pointing to this kind of new generation of creators who are kind of building, kind of the foundations of new platforms in what we're calling a sort of a more transactional future, kind of where digital tools and platforms are dominating, kind of attention. That transactional future is perhaps best symbolized at the moment by the curious rise and kind of frenzy around the NFTs, kind of non-fungible tokens, and this kind of almost obsessional desire to kind of monetize and to create sort of platforms of commerce kind of around kind of art. So this scenario really talks about kind of the emergence of the blockchain, crypto, kind of and sort of has NFTs really in the background as much as anything, and it also starts referring to kind of whether or not kind of this metaverse that we're seeing spoken about kind of in dulcet terms will come into being as a serious platform, and whether it will challenge kind of physical institutions. And there's a healthy dose of anxiety and fear in this platform. It's certainly not in this scenario. It's certainly not a recommendation, kind of, or a forecast, of what will happen. I think it's a summation of a lot of kind of nested anxiety amongst arts leaders about how they would cope kind of in a transactional future dominated by commercialized digital platforms. Actually, I think if anything, there's some real kind of sort of instructive logic that can be taken out of this scenario for institutions like yours or mine or many of the other institutions who are tuning in today about how they fortify their institution against this type of future, and how they, kind of almost, kind of own kind of their institutional mission and double down on it, kind of in a really big way, kind of as a sort of parallel kind of transactional kind of future starts emerging around us.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the opportunity for institutions to define their purpose and impact and value in non-financialized terms is both absolutely critical, but post-pandemic, it's a huge opportunity too, because all those measures that we used to have around tourism value and tourism dollars have evaporated for a period of time. And so that's both a huge threat, but a great opportunity to say, well, actually, we provide a different sort of value. But it's interesting about, I mean, that third scenario was the one as I was watching and reading, that was really the one that felt the most that what was being described were almost the symptoms that crypto and NFTs and in this great financialization of everything, or this desire for right-wing libertarian financialization of everything, is also based on huge social collapse and this sort of sense of creators having no other institutional revenue streams that might have existed in the past, the drying up of philanthropy in America that's coming out of the GFC and now COVID, and this sort of hangover of basically institutional collapse. So these in quotes solutions are solutions to problems that not everyone has and not every community has, and certainly Australia and New Zealand and Singapore and other parts of Asia Pacific don't want to be having to deal with those problems at the scale that the US perhaps people in the US have been reacting to through these means.
It's a super good point, Seb. I mean, one of the other kind of points, if not of collapse, then let's talk about threats and declines, which is a driver kind of here towards individual practitioners being driven towards NFTs as a means of financial survival, is the threats to arts education. And this is something that my colleague Tobias Revel has spoken about really articulately from the context of the UK, that when you kind of make access to kind of arts education extremely expensive. This happened in New Zealand a very long time ago, kind of when I was going to university, but more recently in places like the UK. And therefore you make the desirability of arts education, given that it is so expensive, a little bit more questionable. Then the net effect is that you have less artists who are going into arts education to teach, which is, for so many artists, the second career that funds their practice. You then have less artists who are coming in to do, tutorials or, specialist workshops, which is, again, another supplementary form of income. So that whole ecosystem, which has supported the careers of, whether they're theatre practitioners, designers, visual artists or other forms of arts professionals, has supported independent practice in a way, kind of invisibly. That system has been under, attack, let's say, from a more kind of liberal, let's say neoliberal kind of financial sort of right economic kind of philosophy. And this kind of desire, I guess, to move towards, things like NFTs as an alternative means of financing. If that's your only option, it's very, very hard to kind of point the finger at the artists and say that they're somehow, to blame or greedy or kind of, chasing after, a buck when, without the support of institutions that you and I enjoy, that might be the only way they can pay the rent. So, it really is, as you exactly say, attacking the symptom rather than the, the cause.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic has obviously massively removed other support structures as well. Here in Australia, the university sector has been absolutely decimated, and everything else too. So I think that there's sort of that alternative institutional support for creatives is also something that I think there's an opportunity for institutions to come back with different ways. And I think what was fascinating about the report at large too was that it was drawing out of different forms of creative practice and new people who are doing creative practice, because the tools for creative making have also become more accessible, and that has had changes to all sorts of ways things are able to generate revenue, and how and from who as well.
Yeah, that's it. For the TikTok generation, and even more mysteriously the generation younger than the TikTok generation, who are probably your kids, we are pretty much irrelevant, as institutions. And if we just don't really exist on the kind of conceptual radar, we're not a space of value, or we risk not being, let's say,
Yes, I think it's a risk.
I don't want to speak for every institution, but we certainly have to make the case, to that generation that we can provide, value. It's not inferred because we have beautiful buildings and gorgeous, sumptuous physical exhibitions. But there's a necessity to figure out, what the generation who are living on, TikTok, what their values are, and how, what we do might, bridge and intersect with those values. It's absolutely not a given. And that's and as I say, then there's a generation coming below them, who are just as likely to eschew any form of, kind of digital media, social media kind of networking altogether. And and if that does happen, I guess that's the sort of 12 to 15-year-olds now. How do we talk to them? Because our sector has been so obsessed, kind of with digital communication for the last couple of decades. What happens when that generation starts kind of maturing and becoming adults, and they're not interested in any form of social network? How are we meant to talk to them? We've forgotten how to do that.
Yeah, and I think, it feels, it's interesting also thinking about digital in museums and digitisation and the policy initiatives that have been rolled out across state governments, federal governments, national governments. It feels like those have always been lagging, and it feels like the pandemic has created these greater ruptures that run the risk of us continuing down pathways, as you're saying, with this potential generational behavioural shifts, being out of date much faster, and that sort of agility to be responsive to the changing needs of our communities. We need to invest more in foresight and working with communities to keep pace. Because the pace of other change the pace of policy change is so far behind actual on the ground change. And that brings me to, I guess, the last thing is, both of us are in cities that have relied so much on tourism, and many of the people listening in too will also be in cities or countries that are, very, very reliant on tourism. I was reading an interesting report a couple of months ago now, which was talking about this decade of the 2020s being possibly the end of international travel as a socially accepted behaviour because of climate. That by the 2040s, international travel as we know it will not be. And the pandemic has certainly given us a preview of what that means for our societies and our economies. Well, this obviously ties into decarbonisation and all of this, but, our institutions are on the sort of coalface of this, literally.
They
how's
are.
it been, and what are some of the ways of thinking about this, both coming from your own experience and from the report?
Yeah, well, I can speak more, I think, cogently from my own experience here. So obviously Art Science Museum is in Singapore, and we were built 11 years ago specifically as a tourist-facing kind of institution, which didn't mean, of course, that we didn't put a huge amount of effort into engaging our local population, but we were there to attract, kind of tourists to Singapore. So pre-pandemic, I'll just give you some numbers to kind of paint the picture. Pre-pandemic 2019, we had 1 million visitors to Art Science Museum, and probably around 65% of them were tourists. Obviously 2020 hits, borders close. Our visitation fell to 320,000, 100% locals. And 21 we saw some recovery, which is great to see. But again, no significant numbers of tourists because the border was closed pretty much the entire year. So we now we're now sort of aiming towards kind of building that visitation to around 500,000. Unless we see some significant kind of movement on the border. And that's obviously a 100% kind of local audience. So we've lost half our visitation. And for a museum like ours, which isn't in receipt of public funding, that's half the revenue. We're super reliant on ticket revenue for our business. So it's been a complete kind of root and branch kind of rethink about, kind of what we do, how we do it, kind of how much we do, kind of who we do it for, and what stories, kind of we should be telling now that we're addressing a 100% local audience. So the change has been really profound. What I'd say in terms of the long term is that in Singapore, we're not really in a position where we can face a future where there's no kind of international exchange. That's a future that in New Zealand, kind of we can face. As New Zealanders, we can imagine a future where New Zealand is not networked to the rest of the world. It's quite grim, but New Zealand
very grim.
But New Zealand can actually survive. Kind of like it's got enough food and energy, it can survive. Australia probably would figure out some way of doing so as well. Singapore cannot. Kind of Singapore is built on international trade and international, kind of exchange as a, kind of as a foundation. So the collapse of internationalism is an existential threat, kind of to Singapore. And so whilst in the short term, we can come up with strategies of how to keep our individual institution and our colleague museums and theatres, kind of going through solidarity and an enormous amount of, community cooperation. In the long term, it almost doesn't bear contemplation in a way that I think is fundamentally different to the situation in New Zealand and Australia. And I'm not trying to say that a future of the collapse of international networks is a good thing for either country. It's just that there could be a concept of survival kind of there, whereas that's not the case here. So it's a very deeply uncomfortable kind of thought. And kind of one that we can almost approach better, kind of in terms of very long-term thinking than in the next 10 years. Because if that transpired in the next 10 years, it would be very troubling, kind of indeed.
Yeah, I mean, we would certainly have similar experiences here in Melbourne, I think, because our borders were closed too, and domestic state borders were closed for a period of time too. We saw a really different shift in who came, how many times they came, and also when they came. So weekends have been very, very busy. Weekdays have almost collapsed. But we've changed our hours on weekdays, which has actually allowed us to cater for schools in a different way, which has been really interesting. But I think that existential piece, not just about trade, but it's also the exchange of ideas. And I do really worry that sense of cultural curiosity. I don't, both of us grew up in New Zealand or Australia, and pre-internet, it wasn't a great place, Australia, where I was growing up in Sydney. Yes, but it wasn't even really a global city, and it felt quite disconnected. And I worry that we risk this sort of return to parochialism of the mid 20th century at a time when climate requires global solutions and creative exchange in order to diversify the types and thinking around those, what those global solutions might actually be. And the role of institutions in that, and the role of art, is super important. Not to put the burden on artists or creative practice, but art is a great way of exposing people to new, challenging ideas in ways that they might come to them without aggression. It's a great way of building entity thinking.
We're speaking here, kind of to many of our friends and colleagues in New Zealand, and that, kind of the threat of being isolated when the rest of the world is moving into a different state of accommodation with the pandemic will feel very, very present, kind of to our friends in New Zealand. They'll feel it in their bones, because there is a very strong sense, I think, of being left behind. because rightly or wrongly, and I'm not, kind of making any comments here about, kind of pandemic policy management, many of the larger kind of continents on the planet are moving on. And the sort of return of interconnected sort of collaboration across cultural institutions, but also across economies, is very much underway in Europe, kind of right across North America, in large parts of Asia even, kind of, which is still at a very, very uneven kind of point in terms of pandemic restrictions. So that starts making New Zealand, kind of feel quite like an outlier. And there must be an enormous amount of anxiety there about how long that will continue and how deep then those, kind of fears around a return to, kind of inward looking kind of points of view, may transpire. But let's hope that there is a temporary condition. Kind of, because what can emerge, as we were saying earlier, out of those kind of forced moments of cultural introspection, is some genuine value that I think places like Singapore and New Zealand and Australia can cultivate and kind of then take to the world when the time is right. I think certainly in Singapore and in New Zealand, one thing that we have in common throughout the pandemic kind of management process is a genuine refocusing on kindness and empathy. That's not kind of made up. Kind of like our governments have led the way in that respect, but I think our communities have really followed suit with great authenticity. And if we can hold on to that and kind of take that, kind of back into the world where the time is right, that will be an amazing impact of that kind of forced introspection. So, I do think that there are, kind of threats and risks that we face right now as we're in our various degrees of, kind of isolation. But I would urge us not to, kind of despair, because there's so much that we can take from this moment and cultivate and kind of, kind of and tend to and nurture. And that will have deep value kind of going forward.
I think that's a fabulous line to stop on, Honor. Thanks a lot. That's been really great to chat.
Thank you. It's been really invigorating, and I really wish that we were able to be kind of there in person and see all of our friends and, kind of share our experiences. We've been able to speak about the on-the-record experiences, but I would certainly love to be in the networking room to hear everyone's off-the-record kind of accounts of what it's been like to live through the last 2 years. But this has been really, really wonderful. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.